Welcome to this presentation in which we're going to start the topic of pronouns. If you happen to have the green book, the Aspen Handbook, 3rd edition, we'll be starting on page 17 and we'll be covering the next several pages after that. If you have the 4th edition, the one with the red cover, we'll be starting on page 17 as well, and we'll be covering the next several pages. If you don't have your Aspen Handbook already out and ready, please pause me now, go get the book, and then we'll get started. Okay, well, let's begin. You'll see that in addition to the textbook, we'll also be working with a couple of page long document that I have about the noun pronoun topic. And this is also posted, so you'll be able to see this in the folder with the other pronoun materials. I'm going to go through some pretty dry, boring grammar stuff. And some of this, if you are not a person for whom grammar kind of naturally resonates, your eyes may glaze over and you might get confused. So if it's a source of confusion, listen to it once and then see if the actual steps that you take make sense. If you can understand what you need to do, it's okay if you don't understand why you need to do it. Some people find the why very helpful to being successful at the application. Some people find the why confusing, and it gets in the way of them being successful at applying it. And so I'm going to provide both. I'm going to provide the theory behind it, the reason why, and then I'm also going to provide the nuts and bolts, how you do it. So I would ask that you listen to both parts once and then kind of make a judgment call for you what makes most sense. If you are thrown and you're just not sure, none of it's making sense to you, please come see me. I'm happy to sit down and talk with you, and many times I find that just a face-to-face meeting, it might even be a 5 or 10 minute meeting, the light bulb can go off. I can maybe answer that particular niggling question that you have, and we can move on from that topic. So don't get discouraged if some of this stuff isn't really intuitive for you. Because this is stuff that on some level you already know. There's really nothing that I'm going to be saying today that you don't know. I mean, that's the wonderful thing about this. You know this stuff, every single thing I'm going to say. The thing is that you don't know why this is the rule, but you know the rule. And so we'll be kind of unpacking it. So as soon as the students hear this, a light bulb goes off and they're like, oh, that's why I say it this way. And it's kind of an intriguing little bit of figuring out how their brain works, all the cool things that my brain is doing every day with language. It's pretty remarkable. It's also remarkable when you think about the fact that a 3 or 4-year-old child knows this stuff that is hard for us as an adult to really make sense of. That 2, 3, 4-year-old kid has got well in hand. So it's just a real testament to how sophisticated and amazing our brains are. So don't get discouraged. You know this stuff on some level. It's just a matter of making that knowledge explicit. So let's get started. Some of us in this room have learned a different language at some point in our lives. It might be French or Spanish or Latin or German. In all of those languages, pronouns change. If we're talking about I in French, we'd say je. If we're talking about me in French, it'd be me. If we're talking about well, I won't go through lots of different languages, but you get the that the pronouns change based upon whether it's I or you or he, whether it's plural or singular, depending upon whether it's the person doing the verb or it's the person receiving the action of the verb. And so we have that in most languages, most Western European languages. It's a very common feature. And English has this too. But if you learned English formally through school, maybe you grew up speaking another language in your household, and then you learned English at some point in a formal academic environment, you probably learned these, what I'm about to show you, in a very formal way. In the same way that if you're a native English speaker and that you're learning Spanish, you would have learned this, probably learned from a table very similar to this one. So we're going to kind of go through this and make sense of it, and see how this works. But again, if you're a native English speaker, when you look at this, you're going to be a little thrown. And yet we all know this stuff on some level. If you're in this program, you have a pretty high level of fluency in English, and so you know this stuff. For example, let me just write this sentence. I love him. Okay? We all know that it would be silly for me to say me love him, right? We know that. That might be something Elmo on Sesame Street might say, but a fluent English speaker would never say me love him except as a joke. Similarly, I wouldn't say I love he. That doesn't make sense. Or I love his. That doesn't make sense. So we know this stuff. We know that if we're using that in this position in the sentence we need a pronoun in the objective case. We may not know that name, but our brain knows that we say him here instead of he or instead of his. We know that when the pronoun is in this position, we need a noun in the subjective case. And we know we use I, not me, not my. And so we know this stuff. Now what we're just doing is making explicit this information that we know. And so this is the table. It's somewhat simplified, but this is most of the information that we have. If we're talking about, and again, when we're talking about the first person here, we're talking about ourselves, the speaker, the writer. So when I am writing a letter to my, dear Aunt Mabel, and I'm talking about what I've done over the last 6 months, I'm going to say, when I'm talking about myself, I'm going to use my first person pronouns. In that letter to my dear Aunt Mabel, when I talk about her, maybe I ask her about her plans for the summer or ask how she's feeling. Well, then I'm talking to her directly, and I'm going to be using words like you. That's the second person. My great Aunt Mabel has a son named Harold. When I ask questions about him or maybe relay a story to Great Aunt Mabel about Harold, that's a third person because Harold isn't me. I'm not Harold. And my Great Aunt Mabel isn't Harold. So Harold is a third person in the story. So we would use he or him or his. Let's say Great Aunt Mabel had a best friend named Teresa. And I, in my letter, mentioned Teresa. Well, then I would say she or her or her. If I'm talking about the fact that Great Aunt Mabel has a beautiful home and I'm asking her about how her garden at that home is doing, I would probably refer to it as it. Again, that's the third person. So even we use the term person even when we're not talking about a human being, when we're talking about an inanimate object or say an animal or something like that. So that's what we mean when we think about first, second, or third person. Let me just put that in parentheses. So this is, I'm going to say this is the writer. The second person is the reader. And the third person is someone or something other than the writer and the reader. Okay, so that gives us a sense about these various entities. It's rather important to be able to distinguish first, second, and third person. You may be familiar with these terms if you have read or spent much time reading literature, because it's very common in literature for us to talk about, well, that novel was written in the first person, or that novel was written in the third person. It's pretty rare for novels to be written in the second person. I mean, it's possible to do, but it's pretty unusual. And so if you've been familiar with those terms, we're talking about literature, it's the same idea. We're just kind of applying in a little bit different context. So hopefully that is making sense, the differences between first, second, and third person. Most people don't have a lot of difficulty sorting through plural and singular. Singular, of course, means there's just one. Plural means there's more than one. Might be two, it might be, a million. We don't distinguish beyond, more than one, to the extent that there's more than one. In English, at least. Other languages might make that distinction. So it's pretty easy for us to decide whether we need to have a singular pronoun or a plural pronoun. And hopefully it's pretty straightforward for us to decide whether we are writing first person, we're talking about ourselves, we're talking about the person whom we are directly addressing, or we're talking about someone or something else. So we've pretty much figured out this part. Let me just put this in bold, and we figured out this part. But this is the part that can throw us a little bit. I will tell you, if we were sitting around speaking German right now, this would not throw us. If we were speaking Latin, this would not throw us. If we were speaking Russian, this would not throw us. Once upon a time, Old English, and to some extent even Middle English, was more similar to those languages than it is to modern English. We had at the end of nouns in Old English suffixes, and those suffixes told the listener what the function of that noun was in the sentence. Let me give an example. If we were saying, Bob loves Mary. Well, we would have added something. I'm going to make up some endings here. These are not the right endings. And these endings would have told the listener, that this speaker put US at the end of Bob. That tells me that Bob is the actor in this sentence. He's the one doing the loving. Oh, and the speaker put an EM at the end of Mary, and that tells me that Mary is receiving the verb. She's receiving the love. And so if we were to reverse it, if we were to say, Bob M loves Mary us, the reader would understand that now Mary is the one loving Bob, and Bob is receiving that love. In many languages that put suffixes on words to say what their function is in the sentence, in these languages, sometimes word order has a relatively limited role. And so you can start with the subject, like we did here with Babas loves Miriam. So our first noun is the subject, or you can save the subject to the end of the sentence. After all, because your suffix is telling you what that word's role is in the sentence, you really don't care so much about word order. Now in English, though, in modern day English, we don't have these suffixes. These two sentences have exactly the same words. The only difference is the order. Bob loves Mary, Mary loves Bob. But we know that these sentences mean something very, very different. And the only difference is word order. So in English, in modern English, word order is more important, more prevalent than those suffixes that we have had historically in English. There's lots of theories as to why the suffixes went away. That's really not important to this lesson, but as a result of this change, this emphasis upon word order over suffixes, English became more like French and Spanish, with an emphasis upon word order. But you know what? We're not completely without some importance upon some kind of suffix. It's not 100% word order. And the main way that we still have some remnants of this kind of ancient system from Old English is when we look at pronouns. We can see, and when we use a first person singular noun in the subjective case, we say I. When it's the objective case, we say me. When it's possessive, we say my. So let's just look how that plays out. I love Bob. Okay, I'm the one loving. I'm the subject of the sentence. But when it's Bob loving me, Bob loves me, I'm receiving the love. I'm the object of the sentence, so we use me. If we say Bob loves my sister, now, oops, sorry, let me, we are saying the possessive form, my, here, and I am possessing my sister. Maybe we'll make it even a little clearer. We'll say my car. So those are some examples about how we use these. Now, do we stop and think, what case? These are all cases, by the way. Subjective case, objective case, possessive case. Do we stop when we're speaking and say, I think I need a subjective case pronoun. I need it to be first person singular, objective case. Oh, yeah, that would be I. Okay, that's what I need to use. Oh, no, I need a second person possessive plural. Oh, I need your. Oh, you know what I need? I need third person inanimate object possessive singular. Oh, I need its. No, we don't even think about that. It's automatic pilot. Our brain on some subconscious level is doing all that heavy lifting for us. And you know what? Our brains are very accurate. I mean, every now and again we'll make a mistake, but most of us get it right 90+% of the time. It even sounds wrong when we use the wrong one, and we kind of cringe, or we hear somebody say the wrong one, we kind of almost cringe a little bit. We recognize that it's wrong. We may not know why it's wrong. We may not even be able to say which word is wrong, but just something in our gut says, oops, something went wrong there. And that's what it's because we are programmed with this information in our heads. Okay. So, do you have to commit this to memory? You absolutely don't. As I said, you don't have to commit it to memory because you already know it in your head. So here I'm going to just make this a little bit clearer. So subjective means doer of the verb. Possessive is possessor of the noun. Okay. I'm not here we go. Let me just make this a little bit easier to maybe read. Okay, so I have not put a definition for objective case because actually objective case covers a fair number of items, but I've put it down below here. Objective case applies to 3 different categories. It applies to the object of the sentence, to the indirect object. So I'm going to say the direct object, indirect object, or object of the preposition. Okay, so let's just go over what we mean when we're talking about these items, because I'm listing 3 items and you may not be as clear about the differences between those. Well, what is the direct object? In our sentence, Bob loves Mary. Mary is the direct object. Mary is receiving the verb, the action of the verb. She's receiving the love. Let me give you an example of, not all verbs take indirect objects, so I'm going to give you one. Bob gave the money gave Mary the money. Okay, the money is receiving the action of giving. So it's the direct object. Mary is the indirect object. But for the purposes of this class, you don't even have to know which is which, because in modern English, we use the same case whether it's the direct object, money, or the indirect object, Mary. Let me give you another sentence. Okay, Bob loves the car from Toyota's Flint factory. From is a preposition. The object of the preposition is this phrase. And so this would be also in the objective case if we were to replace it with pronoun. So let's see what those look like. So we're going to replace Mary with the appropriate pronoun. So we're going to be looking in this column. Here we go. So we know we need her. Bob loves her. Now we're going to do the same thing here. Mary is now the indirect object. Bob gave her the money. It's the same because we don't have a difference between direct objects and indirect objects. Bob loves the car from it. Obviously, we would have had to have, actually, well, let's do this. Let's change this to Mary so we can have a consistent statement here. So I guess Mary gave Bob a car. So from her. So you can see in each case we say her because her has to be the choice. We need third person singular objective case. And even though this is a direct object, and this is an indirect object, and this is an object of a preposition, they all need to be an objective case. So you really don't need to know. You don't need to be able to identify these parts for this purpose. I mean, it's good to, but it's not necessary to write it correctly. Okay, so let's talk about possessive case. Now, I said before that in English, we are primarily concerned with, by the way, this is called declension. That's the term for it. You don't need to know that for this class, but that's the formal name for it. And so we've been talking about how to decline pronouns. And I said before that once upon a time in English, we did this to nouns too, and nouns had all kinds of funky endings. But I said that's pretty much gone away. And the key word there is pretty much, or the two keywords there are pretty much, because we do have just a tiny remnant of the system of declension from Old English. And that we see right here. Bob's coat. We put an apostrophe S to show possession. Well, guess what? That is a case. That is the possessive case. We don't add anything to Bob when Bob is the subject of the sentence. We don't add anything when Bob is the object of the sentence, when we say, Mary loves Bob. But we do add something to Bob when we're talking about him possessing something. So when we're using possessive, we have to add that apostrophe S. So we do have a tiny little remnant of the case system that was so significant in Old English. We do have the possessive case. So really there are two aspects of English that still has a declension: the pronouns and the possessive case. for nouns. Okay, so let's see how possessive pronouns work in English. And here are our lists. Let's just look at, I'm going to make this go away. Here, get this back to, let's just look at these two columns here though. So here are possessive columns. So when I want to refer to something that I possess, my car, my book, my time, or something that I possess with someone else, our house, or if I want to talk about you, the person to whom I am corresponding, I'll say your client or your car. And if I'm talking to you, maybe you're the opposing counsel and I'm talking about the opposing counsel's client who's a man, I might say his lawsuit. Or if it's a group of people suing, their claim against my client. And so these are examples of the possessive format. You might see here that there's not a lot of pattern here. You can see as soon as we add an R, there's a little bit of that here because we have an R here, we have an R here, we have an R here, we have an R there. So there does seem to be something with adding an R to the possessive case. You may see here that there are sometimes two choices that we have. Let's look at that for a second. And again, you know this stuff. This isn't stuff that I'm telling you. I am just formalizing and I'm communicating information that you already have. So if I were to say, she is my sister, so I am putting this possessive pronoun in front of the noun that is being possessed. We actually say this is an adjective because it's describing or modifying the word sister. But if I were to say instead, she is mine, I'm not following it with the sister. It is the end of the sentence. It is acting like a noun would act. It is truly acting like a pronoun. It is replacing a noun. It's not acting as an adjective from a grammatical standpoint. And so we choose whether to use my or mine depending upon whether it's being followed by the noun and therefore acting like an adjective. Not all of our pronouns have two cases. Have two versions of the possessive. His and its don't. But the others do. And for the most part, we typically in English more commonly use the adjective form. My, your, his, her, its, our, your, and their, instead of the form that doesn't require a noun after it. Okay, let's also talk about another way we can describe possessive pronouns. And I have it here. We can say Bob's coat, and again here we're using the possessive case because we're adding that apostrophe S, and we have a separate presentation over this topic. But we can also rewrite it. We can take this noun here that is being possessed, put it in front of Bob, add the word of, and remove the apostrophe S, right? We can do this. And we had a presentation about apostrophes, which we've already covered, and you may have thought at the time, well, why did we drop that apostrophe S? Don't really think I made that super clear because it wasn't really the time for us to talk about that. Well, now is the time. Now, this expression is the object of the preposition of. And so now it's no longer in the possessive case, it's in the objective case. Well, when we're in the objective case and we're dealing with a noun, that noun doesn't have any kind of suffix. We would just say Bob. So even though these are equivalent statements in terms of meaning, from a grammar standpoint, the grammar involved is pretty different. And the same thing applies to when we have pronouns. His coat. This is analogous to Bob's coat. We have again, we would look here, we look at third person, singular, possessive case. Here's the choice we need. Okay, but now we're going to rewrite it. We're going to put the coat in front. We're going to add the word of, which is a preposition. So now we're going to need third person, singular. It's going to be the object of the preposition, so we need this form. And that's what we use here, the coat of him. Most of the time we'll get this right, but sometimes people will accidentally say this. More often say it than write it, but occasionally people will write this. They will say the coat, here we go. The coat of Bob's, right? They will forget and what's happening here is that we have kind of two things going on in our head. We're thinking, well, what I really mean is that it's Bob's coat. And so we're thinking a little bit about this, but then we also are aware that we're using a prepositional phrase. And so we use the prepositional phrase, but then we revert to this other format. So we're confusing two different things. And so we might say this, the coat of his. But this is wrong. This is incorrect because this isn't possessive. This should be in the objective case. So this is correct. And this is correct. And this is correct. And this is correct. Okay. A very common problem. So this is an example. The reason again that people get confused here is that the meaning of it is the same as this. So the grammar structure, we get momentarily confused whether we're looking at the structure of the sentence from a grammar standpoint or the inherent meaning of the words. We have another time that we have problems with this, and this is when we typically when we are using a preposition. We have, many of us, been discouraged from using me or him, or we've been discouraged from using the objective case. We've been kind of told, not formally, but there's kind of an idea out there that somehow or another the subjective case is to be preferred. I think it goes back to the idea that we have been told we should say, it is I. We should not say, it is me. There's a lot of reasons why we're supposed to say, it is I, but because we've been told that, and many of us didn't really know why it is I is correct over it is me, because it's a fairly subtle grammar point, we kind of got it into our head, oh, okay, well, whenever I can use I ought to. If I'm on the fence between using I and me, or if I'm on the fence between using he and him or she and her, I ought to err on the side of using the subjective case, because somehow or another that's more grammatically correct. So let's look at this example. I traveled to France with Mary and I want to say Bob, but I want to use a pronoun for Bob, okay? So this is the structure, so I'm going to put this in quotes. Well, I know I need a third person, singular pronoun. So I know I need he, him, or his. So let's just write those out. Let's just look at the choices. I traveled to France with Mary and he, him, or his. I mean, obviously only one of these can be correct. And so I traveled to France with Mary and he. I traveled to France with Mary and him. I traveled to France with Mary and his. Most of us would say, I'm pretty sure his isn't right. But between he and him, I'm just not sure. And then that sense in our head that, oh, whenever I can use he, I ought to use he over him. So people tend to fall into the practice of saying he instead of him. And this also happens. Let's say this time it's Bob was traveling with either Mary and I or Mary and me. The same thing happens. Bob traveled to France with Mary and I. Bob traveled to France with Mary and me. Something just makes us think that I is better. Well, there's a simple test that you can perform that is almost impossible to get wrong if you are a pretty fluent English speaker. The secret is, and here's the actual equation. Let's walk through this. So we have this sentence. We have a preposition. Our preposition here is with. So let me put that in. We'll put it in pink. So this is our preposition, pink. And then we have a noun or pronoun. In this case, we have Mary. So we're going to make this, we'll put it in yellow. And then we have our conjunction. In this case, we're using and. Most of the time, it's going to be and or. In this case, it's and, so I'm going to use baby blue for and. And then we have the pronoun that we're going to use. And I'm going to put that in green. And so it's what's going to replace Bob. So I'm going to go back to he or him. Oops. Okay. Oops. So this is what we've done. Now what we're going to remove is the noun or pronoun, which is Mary, and the conjunction. So we're going to remove this. And then we're going to read it. I traveled to France with he. I traveled to France with him. You know immediately that him is correct. So you know if Mary isn't part of the story, him is correct. And so we can add Mary and back, or whatever the words we were, and we know it's correct. I traveled to France with Mary and him. So here's an example of another sentence. I went with Bob and we're going to add some pronoun that means female singular pronoun. So in this case, we're going to be looking for she, her. I guess I should put that in a different color. Well, let me just make the green, not be. So she, her, or her. Okay. And so we're gonna make the Bob and go away because that's the noun and conjunction. I went with. Should I say I went with she, or should I say I went with her? Well, we would say I went with her. And so now I add back the Bob and. I went with Bob and her. That's a pretty foolproof test for you to check. Don't count on Microsoft Word getting this correct. Microsoft Word will sometimes get it correct and sometimes not get it correct. It's a pretty subtle analysis, but you can rely upon your ear. You can also, let's say that English isn't your first language and so you aren't sure that your ear is going to steer you right. Another strategy would be to look for the preposition, and you know once you have a preposition, you know that this phrase here is the object of the preposition. Well, you know that you need to use objective case because we have object of the preposition right there. So you can either trust your ear or trust your understanding of case in English. Either way will lead you to the correct answer. Okay, so now we're going to go on. So these are the kind of most likely misses with how this structures out, how the various parts fit together. Now again, if your head is spinning and you're like, I can't get this subjective, objective, possessive, first, second, third person. My head is spinning. I don't know what you're saying. That's okay. That's okay. You can still use this test right here. You can still remove Bob and see what sounds right to your ear. You don't need to know the theory to get to the finish line. But if you're the type of person that if I know why it works, it's going to help me remember what to do, then the theory can be good. So whatever makes sense for you, rely upon that. If the theory doesn't make sense, disregard that. Okay, we're going to move on. We're going to talk about this is chapter 1, section G to C. We'll talk about some other parts of this in a couple of minutes, but let's just pull up the book here. By the way, what I've covered so far, we'll see here we're in chapter 1, section G, we're in section 1 right here. We've kind of gone through and talked about the various parts. And you can see that they have the same tip that we covered, removing the Ted and, which was like the Bob and. So this is a little bit of a discussion about that tendency here. And you can see that there are lots of examples here. You must give John and I directions. Well, let's remove John and. You must give I directions. Well, we know it must be me. You must give me directions. So you remove the John and, get the right pronoun, and then add John and back. We urge you to release Susan and he from their employment contracts. Get rid of Susan and, we listen to it. We urge you to release he from, okay, well that doesn't sound right. We urge you to release him. Okay, and so now we can add Susan back, Susan and him. She has provided the committee and we with the budget analysis. We get rid of committee and she has provided we with the budget analysis? No, she has provided us with the budget analysis. So we put the committee and back with us, and we have she has provided the committee and us with the budget analysis. Between you and I, this one's a little tricky because you need to have two nouns. You need to have two, to have something between, you obviously have to have two items. But you can hear between I doesn't sound right. Between me sounds right. And the reason that it doesn't, between I doesn't sound right is that between is a preposition. And the object of a preposition has to be that objective case. Well, me is in the objective case, I is in the subjective case. And so it should be between you and me, the defendant is guilty. So this is just an example, more extended example of this thing that we were talking about here. This tip. Oh, sorry, here. We talked about rewriting it. Okay, now we're going to go on and we're going to start talking about pronoun agreement. So, nouns, a pronoun, let's first of all talk about what a pronoun is. A pronoun is a word that is there to replace a noun. It will function in the same way that that noun would have in the sentence. We use pronouns primarily so we don't keep on saying the same noun 50 times. It gets to be kind of boring to our ears to keep on saying Bob, 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 Bob. Of course, Bob is a really short word, so we're not really saving breath. It's as easy pretty much to say Bob as it would be to say he or him. But let's say it was, you know, the Great American Corporation Incorporated. Well, that's a lot of syllables to say. It would be a lot easier to just say it, right? And so sometimes we really do kind of save breath and ink if we have an the equivalent of an abbreviation, which is what a pronoun does. So pronouns are useful, but pronouns can be problematic. One problem with pronouns is that they can be ambiguous. If you have in your story, let's say Bob and Larry are best friends and you're telling a story about them, and you've mentioned both Bob and Larry in the story, and then you start talking about he. Well, the reader isn't sure, well, when you say he, do you mean Bob or do you mean Larry? Or maybe you're talking about two different corporations that are considering a merger. And one is ABC Corporation, the other is DEF Corporation. And you start saying it has assets of $5 million. Well, is it ABC Corporation or is it DEF Corporation? It's ambiguous. So when you use pronouns, there's a greater chance of ambiguity. Well, I mean, in novels and in poetry, sometimes ambiguity is a good thing. There can be some artistic merit to it, but not in the law. We want to be very, very precise with our language. And so as a result, we don't use pronouns as often as you would find in other writing samples. And particularly in a contract, you probably won't see pronouns at all in that document. In briefs and in other documents you may see it, but not in contracts or wills for the most part. So because we're just very concerned about ambiguity, and as a result of that, we do pronouns, or let me put it this way, we follow the rules about pronouns very rigorously. I'm about to explain some rules to you that your ear may not be attuned to hear. I say that because my ear, when I speak, doesn't catch this error. And I think it's true that most English speakers, even those of us who are native English speakers, don't get this right when we speak. So it requires an effort on our part when we write to catch these mistakes, because most of us, when we write, we're in some sense writing down what we're hearing in our head. But if what we hear in our head is incorrect, we're going to write it down incorrectly. So we have to go back and make sure that we're getting it right. So this is a little bit trickier than some of the things that we're going to talk about. So I'm going to talk about the rule, which is easy, and you already know it because, again, your brain's been programmed. And then we'll talk about how it can get tricky in English. Okay, so we've talked about the fact that a pronoun has to replace a noun. When we're using first person pronouns, that's pretty easy. When I say I, and let's say I'm writing a letter to my great Aunt Mabel, and I say, "Dear Aunt Mabel, thank you so much for that beautiful graduation gift. I just love my new lamp. It looks great in my dorm room." Well, it was obvious in the context who this I is, because I means the first person. It means the writer. And so we don't actually need a pronoun, we don't need a noun to go before that. I don't have to say, "Dear Aunt Mabel, I am Cynthia Groover, your niece." And now I'm going to start using the I pronoun to describe myself. No, it's obvious in the sentence that whenever we say I, we mean the writer. And whenever we say you, we mean the reader. In this case, great Aunt Mabel. So when we're using first and second pronouns, we don't need antecedents. We don't need to have stated it formally. Hey, great Aunt Mabel, I wrote this letter. If when great Aunt Mabel gets the letter from me, she will have probably scanned to the end of the letter and say, "Oh, who signed it? Oh, it's my niece, Cynthia Groover. She signed it." Or more likely, she will have noticed the address on the envelope, and then she'll immediately know. And of course, she knows who she is, right? So she doesn't need to be introduced to herself. So when we say that a pronoun needs an antecedent, we're not talking about first-person pronouns. We're not talking about second-person pronouns. We're talking about this row of pronouns. We're talking about third-person pronouns. Because in that letter that I'm writing to great Aunt Mabel, when I say he did X or she did X, it's not obvious who that is, but it is obvious who I am, and it's obvious who you are in that context. So this is the situation that we can have some ambiguity. So how do we go about minimizing, or hopefully virtually eliminating, the ambiguity in this sentence? Well, of course, the first thing is we have to have, when we're using a third-person pronoun, we have to have an antecedent noun. Antecedent literally means come before. Ante means before, and cedent means coming. So we need a noun that appears before it in the sentence, or not necessarily in the sentence, but in the document. Oftentimes it will be in the sentence, in the same sentence that includes a pronoun. That's fine. It can be in the preceding sentence. It can even be higher up, but you want it relatively close, and you want it relatively close so that it is unambiguous. So the reader immediately knows without scanning up higher to see, oh, now who does she mean when she says he here, or who does she mean when she says it here? And so you want to keep it as close as possible. And again, it has to appear before. So you can't use the pronoun and then use the noun for the first time. So the first thing is when we're using third person pronouns, we need an antecedent noun, and it needs to be pretty close. So we need to kind of check this off. If you are concerned that you are having difficulty tracking your pronouns, it's not a bad thing as one of your edits to your documents to go through and to do a word search for all of these pronouns here, and you'd have to do them individually. Search for all the he's, search for all the she's, search for all the it's, and the hims and the hers, and the his and the hers, and the theys and the thems and the there and the theirs. Go through each one and then look and find, well, where's that antecedent noun? Is it coming before it in the document? Is it relatively close? And is it unambiguous? When I read it, is it obvious who the pronoun is, who or what the pronoun is referring to? Okay, so let's assume that we've done the work and we have covered this first section, that we've successfully addressed that issue. Now we're going to go to the next one, and this is the one that can be a little bit more, this can be a problem, I'm not going to lie to you, this one can be a problem, but this one is a little bit more insidious of a problem. And this one, we need our pronoun to match its antecedent number, noun in number and person. Let's go back up here and review what number and person are. Okay, well, number means plural or singular or plural. And person means first, second, or third person. Also, I should add number. Okay, but we don't have to match it in case. So if our pronoun that occurs earlier was in the subjective, if our noun that came earlier was in the subjective case, but we're going to refer to that same person in the objective case, that's okay. So let's imagine a sentence. Let me just kind of go through. So we're going to say, Bob loves Mary. Well, Bob is the subject of the sentence. So this Bob, even though we don't change the format, if we were to use a pronoun, we would have to use he, right? He loves Mary, but we're not using a pronoun here. Now we're going to have another sentence. We're going to say Mary loves him. Did I use the right pronoun? Well, let's look at a couple of things. The first thing I can say is that it's not ambiguous. Under these circumstances, there's only one male in our story, and his name appears in the sentence immediately before this one. So I think it's very obvious that the him refers to Bob. Okay, so we've resolved our first issue. We definitely have a lack of ambiguity. Now we're looking for number, person, and gender. Okay, so number means is it plural or singular? Okay, so here's our thing. Okay, well, Bob is singular. There's only one Bob. He may be married, but singular grammatically. And him is singular, right? We can look here at our table, and this is the singular section, and he is right here, him. Okay, so we can check off number. I'm just going to cross a line to show, yeah, we're good with that. Now we're going to look at person. Well, we know that Bob, we're not calling Bob I, we're not calling Bob you. So Bob is by definition going to be third person in this situation. He's someone other than the writer and someone other than the reader. Well, him is also in third person. because we're not saying me or we're not saying you. We're saying him, someone other than the reader, someone other than the writer. So it looks like we're okay with person. Then our last hurdle is gender. Well, Bob is masculine and him is masculine. So we have all the three satisfied, but we don't have the same case. As we've already determined, Bob, our antecedent noun, is doing the verb of the sentence that his name appears. He's the subject of the sentence. But in the sentence that our pronoun appears, he's the object of the sentence. He's receiving the verb, so he's the objective case. They don't have to match case. One can be objective, one can be subjective, but they have to match the other three characteristics. Now, they might match case. It's not wrong if they do, but it's not a requirement. They must match number, person, and gender. Okay, so let's, but you know what? Even though this sounds like a lot of rules that you have to, maybe consciously think about, as a practical matter, well, no, you don't. Because we all know immediately what this sentence means. We all, in our brains, kind of do the math and know that this is grammatically correct and that we are okay with this sentence. This isn't a hard one for us to sort through. But there is a tricky situation that can arrive. Let me get rid of this so we get this all on one line. Okay. And this is because of another problem that we have in English. It's kind of almost a good thing that we have this problem, because it shows that we maybe have a little bit higher level of sensitivity to things. For those of y'all that are of a Christian tradition, especially a Protestant tradition, you've probably at some point in your life read or been exposed to the King James Version of the Bible. The King James Version was written around the time of Shakespeare. So it's written in that same type of language that we hear in Shakespeare. It's very beautiful to hear. A quirk of that time period is that the word he and him and his was sometimes used not just to refer to men, but also to refer to mankind generally or humankind generally. So you might have a sentence that says, the sinner should repent of his sins, for example. Now, in the King James Version of the Bible, or any other piece of literature written at the time, the translator or the writer did not mean, well, this rule only applies to the male of the species. Women don't have to repent of their sins. No. Instead, what was meant is he or she. But they didn't say he or she, because the his was understood under those circumstances to be referring to any human being. Now, of course, sometimes it just referred to men, so you had to look for context to figure out, was this use of him or this use of his or this use of he, was it being gender specific, or was it incorporating or encompassing all of humanity? So that was how language worked back in the time of Shakespeare and King James. But it's a little bit different now. That use of language where we say he, him, or his to include both men and women is considered maybe not the most sensitive way of speaking in modern English. And so as a result, we don't think, but our language has evolved to the point that most of us, when we hear he, him, or her, he, him, or his, we don't think, women are included in that. We tend to think that's a statement about gender. And so we've lost that kind of, I'm going to call it flexibility. You might think it's a positive, you might think it's a negative, but what existed once upon language we don't have. But we don't have a good replacement word. We don't have a word in English that means he or she. I mean, we can say he or she, but when we don't know the gender of a person, it's very difficult to replace that person with a pronoun. The teacher came into the classroom. He frowned. Well, if we know the teacher's a man, that sounds great. The teacher came into the classroom. She frowned. Okay, that also works if we know the teacher's a woman. But what if we don't know the gender of that teacher? The teacher came into the classroom. He or she frowned. Well, that works because now we're not making a statement about gender. But that's kind of a stilted, artificial way of speaking. Most of us don't say that routinely. It's grammatically correct and it helps resolve that ambiguity. So there's lots of positives with that approach, but it's not something that rolls off of our tongue. And when we're speaking, it's probably not that likely that we'll say that. So we native English speakers have developed kind of a workaround for this to resolve this particular problem. So when we have what's called a generic noun, a noun that in which the entity that we're talking about, the person that we're talking about actually does have a gender. So we're talking about a human being, but we're using a noun that could apply to men or to women. And now we want to replace it with a pronoun. We're trying to figure out how to do that. Well, this is an example of the problem here. This child wrote their name on the paper. Well, child is obviously a human being. We don't refer to animal young as child. And so we say the child here. But children come in two flavors, right? Boys and girls. And so we don't know what pronoun to use because we don't know whether this child is a male child, a boy, or a female child, a girl. So we can't say, of course, we're in this case, we want to use the possessive case because he's owning his or her name. So we don't know whether to use his or her. We know we don't want to use its because this is a child, not a dog. But his doesn't sound right because it may be a girl. Her doesn't sound right because it may be a boy. So what we've ended up doing commonly in speech is saying their. Because when we say their, we're not making any statement about gender because their can be male or female. The problem, of course, though, is that their is plural. It doesn't match child in number. And remember, that was one of the things that it has to match. Has to match in number. Now, it does a good job matching in person and in gender, but it doesn't match in number, and so that's a problem. So we can't say, let me put it this way. It is grammatically incorrect to write this. It's also technically grammatically incorrect to say this. And you may be a better speaker. I'm sure you are a better speaker than I am. That's not hard to do. But I will tell you that during this lecture, I have made this error multiple times. Sometimes I've even caught myself saying it. I thought, no, I'm not going to correct myself because that sounds stupid. But we say this many of us say this all the time. And my guess is more people in the class than don't will say this from time to time. They will say their when their antecedent noun is singular. So this is grammatically incorrect. I'm going to tell you now that in my opinion, I think it's okay to make this spoken grammar error. It's still an error, but it's so common that I think it's okay. But it's not okay in legal writing to write this error because we're not matching, our pronoun is not matching its antecedent in number. And this is plural, and this is singular, and that's a no-go. Okay, so we have three ways of fixing this problem. The first way would be to change child. The second would be to change their. And the third is to totally rewrite the sentence. Okay, so if I know the gender of the child, I could say the girl wrote, and now it's easy, her name, because obviously girls are only feminine. They have to be female, right? So that's easy. Girl equates to her. We're matching number, they're both singular. Person, they're both third person. Gender, they're both female. So check, check, check. We're good. So I've used this first strategy. Let me rewrite it in the second example using the next strategy, which is to change the pronoun. The child wrote his or her name on the paper. I don't know whether it's a boy or a girl, and so I'm going to keep child. And so now I have to come up with a pronoun that is going to match number, person, and gender. Well, I'm matching number here because his or her is singular, so is child. His or her is third person, so is child, and the gender could be masculine or could be feminine. Child could be masculine or could be feminine. So this works. It's a little bit awkward. I'm not saying it's, poetry in motion, but it's grammatically correct. It's tons better than this. There are probably even better ways of writing it, but you know what? In my opinion, this is plenty good enough. To do. It's not the best probably, but it is very, very acceptable. But there are other strategies that we could do. One is you could just decide not to use a pronoun and repeat the noun. The child wrote the child's name on the paper. This is super easy to do, and you've absolutely communicated your idea successfully. I mean, you don't even have to worry about ambiguity if you're not actually using a pronoun, right? So this is, again, not the most lyrical way of writing, but it is very, very acceptable. A third approach is to get rid of the pronoun and just to replace it with a noun marker. You might use the word the, you might use the word a or an instead here, or this or that. The child wrote the name on the paper. Now this might be ambiguous. What name? Maybe the name of her elementary school or the name of his next door neighbor. It doesn't follow that it's the child's name, but maybe the previous sentences in the context had made it clear what the child would be writing. And so it might not be ambiguous in the context, but it's a little bit ambiguous here, I think. Then we could fundamentally rewrite the sentence. Really, and I don't have a dramatic rewrite here, just a little bit. The child wrote Annie on the paper. Presumably this child is named Annie, right? That's what would make sense in the context. And so I've gotten rid of the pronoun. In fact, I've gotten rid of the whole word name. And so this will work. This is a strategy that can make sense. So you can play around with these as successful strategies. I do suggest that when you are doing your revisions, unless you're much better at this than I am, and that could well be the case, that you, wait a second, wrong button here, that you do word searches for these words. Because if you're like me, you will write these in an earlier version, and you'll go back and you'll say, well, is my antecedent noun plural? If it isn't, then I'm going to have to use one of these strategies to make it grammatically correct. This is pretty much of a deal breaker in legal writing. It creates ambiguity. That's one problem with it, because after all, when you read this, wait a second, the child wrote their name on the paper. Well, the child isn't plural, so who is this there? I don't know what you're talking about. It puts in that idea of ambiguity, because it obviously can't be referring to child, so child can't be the antecedent. Many times, though, the ambiguity is grammatical. It's really not literal. Everybody hearing it knows what is meant, but it communicates to the reader, and many legal professionals are grammar nerds. Hey, this person doesn't know this basic grammar rule. And so you lose a lot of your street credibility, so to speak, with your audience. And the takeaway is, if they can't make their nouns and pronouns agree, why should I trust anything that they're saying in this document? It's a pretty big deal to make this mistake. Now, have good legal documents been submitted that have had this error? Sure. If things slip by anybody, there's typos in documents. I mean, I don't want to make it sound like every document ever written is pristine and perfect, but this is a pretty big problem, and is one that you definitely need to, if it is an issue with you. It is with me, so I'm going to assume that there are other people that are in my same boat, to do that check. I grade lots of assignments with this problem, and I would say at least half of the students in my class, even after having listened to this presentation, will not catch this error or will commit this error independently. It is not something most students, their ears will not hear this problem. So it's something that requires a little bit of effort, a little bit of conscious, deliberate reflection to get this right. But it's a very important payoff, and it's not hard to do. You just have to find that antecedent to make sure it matches numbers. Challenging yourself whenever you use these pronouns. So we have now covered the Chapter 1, Section G to C. And in subsequent lectures, we'll cover other parts of the Noun Pronoun Agreement section. I hope that this has been helpful for, let me just make sure I haven't covered anything else. So what we've covered here is, here we go. So this is that singular they. Let's just read this. And so this is what I was talking about before, the singular they, that the child wrote their name. In 2016, the American Dialect Society voted the singular they as the word of the year, as in everyone wants their brief to be read. They was recognized for its usefulness as a way of referring to people who may be gender fluid and do not want to be called he or she, as well as a sensible solution to English's lack of a gender-neutral third-person singular personal pronoun. The decision follows that of the Washington Post, which embraced the singular they in 2015. Nevertheless, although you may see they used as a singular, most legal writers and readers are traditionalists and would object to such use. Thus, in legal writing, an attorney must represent the interests of his or her client, or an attorney must represent the interests of the client, rather than an attorney must represent the interests of their client. Attorney is singular, so you can't say their in this context. Okay, so this is just a little update about the they-their rule. In 20 years, will it become acceptable in legal writing to use a singular they? I don't know. It might well be the case, but we're not there this year, and I don't think we'll be there in the next 5 years. So it's definitely something to spend some time to work on so that you won't run afoul of the rules. Here we go. We're going to go down here to, here we have the generic nouns. A generic noun is one that can refer to men or women, such as athlete, attorney, defendant, juror, or plaintiff. These generic nouns usually take a singular pronoun. And then this is a little reflection on this. So we will go on and cover the other parts of the Noun Pronoun Agreement issue in a subsequent lecture. Thank you for your attention and have a wonderful day.